There's a lot of talk about statins causing type 2 diabetes. Today we're going to take a look at that. Stay tuned. First, we really have to understand, how is type 2 diabetes diagnosed? Let's look at the CDC's definitions, and there are basically three ways. There's the A1C test, or HbA1c test, which is a 3-month rolling average of your blood glucose levels. And if you're below 5.7%, well, you're in the normal range, and you can see the values here. Mine happens to be 5.4%, so by this criteria, I'm not a type 2 diabetic. Another way is to look at fasting blood sugar test. That is, after a fast, usually after an overnight fast, in the morning you take your blood glucose. I actually have a pronounced dawn effect. A lot of times my values stray up over 100 into the 100 to 110 range. So by that definition, I could be pre-diabetic. And the most complete way to do it is by way of a glucose tolerance test. There are different tests, but the one that I took recently was one where I drank 75 grams of glucose water, semi-nasty tasting stuff, and then they measured my sugar and insulin after 1 hour and after 2 hours. And by the CDC definition, if it's after 2 hours and you're under 140, then you're in the normal range. Mine was 136, so skirting the upper edge of it. But my 1 hour test was over 200, and my doctor is concerned and feels that any time it goes over 200, then you're by definition a diabetic. I could be normal, I could be pre-diabetic, I could be diabetic. I happen to eat a low-carb diet, so if I were diabetic, I could still have a low HbA1c. So that's one of the limitations of the HbA1c. But let's take a closer look at that. If you were to take this literally, and we're just going to look at HbA1c because that's the easiest one to comprehend and it's the one that's most commonly used, then at 5.6% you're normal, but at 5.7% you're pre-diabetic. So something magical happened there, things suddenly got worse. And then the same thing at the transition between pre-diabetes to diabetes. A lot of the studies that we see which are measuring what is the impact of statin on type 2 diabetes, they're actually looking at new-onset diabetes. And that is when somebody goes over the edge from pre-diabetes to diabetes. That's a very narrow amount of information for us. That's just telling us that there are some people who are close to the edge and maybe they get pushed over the edge. The real way we should be looking at type 2 diabetes is as a continuum. There's a slope here. The higher your HbA1c, the more risk of complications there are. So if you're in a normal range and you go up by 0.2%, doesn't sound like much, but in HbA1c terms that actually is a lot, then you're moving up the slope. If you go up from 6.3 to 6.5, you happen to cross over the boundary there. It's an arbitrary boundary, but they have to set something. And you go from pre-diabetes into diabetes. And if you're already diabetic and your HbA1c goes up, well, you're still pushing up the slope. It's just that you don't have a new diagnosis. And by the way, people with diabetes, many of them have HbA1cs over 10. For a lot of people, the goal by their doctor with medication and diet is to get the HbA1c down to 7.5. That's not even on this chart here, but we have to remember that when we see the reports, they're talking about that very narrow situation there. So we can't really get a lot of information out of that, but we can get some. So let's look at some studies. There are a ton of studies out there. I have links to all the ones I'm speaking about here in the description, but if you type in statins and diabetes, you'll see a lot of information. First one I want to talk about is statin-related new-onset diabetes appears driven by increased insulin resistance. That's the title says it all. And that is as opposed to decreased insulin production. If you think about it and know about diabetes, you will know that there are two ways for the HbA1c to go up, and that is increased insulin resistance, which means you need more insulin to try pushing the blood glucose into the cells where they're needed, and the glucose hangs around in the blood longer. The other way that the HbA1c could go up is if there was decreased insulin production. So that would be a consideration and a question that's legitimate to ask. We know that statins reduce cholesterol. We can imagine, if we don't know the mechanisms too well, that it could also decrease insulin production. Well, that's not what's happening. It seems that it is an increase in insulin resistance, so that's kind of a bad thing. Increasing insulin resistance basically is increasing risk of diabetic complications. The next paper is the effect of high-potency statins on HbA1c in patients with or without diabetes. That cited an increase of 0.4% in HbA1c. This was obviously people who on average had diabetes, and that happened in 4.5 years. So that's 0.1% per year. That might not sound like much, but think about it. If you're on statins for 2 decades, you're going up potentially 2%. That could potentially take you from perfectly normal up into the diabetic range. We don't know if that's the case. and that's a problem. Many articles are quick to point out low absolute increases in new-onset diabetes when the relative risk increases look bad. For example, sometimes it's stated, well, the incidence of new-onset type 2 diabetes is double in the treated group than it was in the placebo group. That looks bad, so a lot of organizations talk about the absolute risk increase, which seems very low, but remember, we're looking at that very narrow subset of people who happen to push over the boundary there. So I just find it interesting that they will talk about relative risk reductions when it comes to the use of statins, but they'll go to the absolute numbers, which are always smaller when they're talking about increases in risk. So there was another paper, and I found this interesting because it seemed to be written for patients. There was a paragraph, and this is the entire paragraph under this heading: what if I already have diabetes? Will statin therapy make it worse? Good question that we might want to answer. So let's read through this. There are a wealth of clinical data showing that patients with diabetes benefit greatly from statin therapy to prevent cardiac events. Okay, we're not going to argue with that right now because that's not the point of why I'm looking at this. I just want to go through what they were saying. The current data do not support discontinuing statins if you have diabetes mellitus or if you are newly diagnosed with diabetes. That's interesting because that's actually extracting a value judgment out of the data. And then finally they say it also remains important to increase your exercise as tolerated, make healthy food choices, and control portion sizes, etc., etc. And I think we'd all agree with that third statement. But one thing you'll notice here, the question in the headline is not answered in this paragraph. What seems to be going on here is you see that headline and a casual reader looks at it and says, okay, it says I should stay on the statins. But it doesn't answer the question. Will statin therapy make it worse? Well, this is like asking a politician a question and they don't answer the question. That means they don't want to give you the answer. And it seems to me that the answer is yes. Statin therapy will make it worse. Whether you have diabetes or not, it's going to push up your HbA1c for probably a certain percentage of people. I don't know that it's actually everybody. Well, let's look at a more balanced paper. This one here, where they say the higher risk of diabetes progression associated with statin use may seem, that's my emphasis, I added the emphasis in this, less consequential, at least in short and intermediate term, than the benefits of statin use, especially when used for secondary prevention. So they mention secondary prevention, they call that out specifically. However, diabetes has long-term effects on quality of life and treatment burden, which warrant consideration when discussing the overall risk-benefit profile. These people get it. They're saying, let's consider this instead of just saying stay on your statins because that's what we want you to do. So what are the complications from type 2 diabetes? Well, this is from Diabetes UK website, and they list these. Well, there's eye and vision problems, retinopathy. Whenever you see PATHY, the pathy suffix, it basically means disease, so eye disease. People can go blind from severe diabetes. Foot problems leading to amputation. I mean, this is real. I was at a meeting with a lawyer once just to sign some legal papers for a house closing. And during the small talk beforehand, he mentioned to me that he had to go get his handicap placard renewed so that he could park closer to the buildings in the handicap spots. And they asked him if he still needed it. His response was, when my foot grows back, I'll let you know. Because he actually had a foot amputated because of the complications from diabetes. There's the heart attack and stroke. Is a type 2 diabetes complication. Now I have this highlighted because that's exactly what statins are supposed to be treating. The contention by the statin pushers is that the increase in risk from type 2 diabetes is more than offset by the decrease in risk from statins. That's their position. Whether we believe it or not, that's their position. There's kidney dysfunction. There is nerve damage. There is gum disease. There is increased cancer risk, sexual dysfunction in both men and women, and life-threatening conditions such as ketoacidosis. And I recommend you actually go to the link that I have in the description and you can actually read a little bit more detail on each of these complications. And they go on to actually describe HbA1c, and they say that we know that higher your HbA1c level, the more you're at risk of developing complications. And they explain what HbA1c is. And then they go on to say even a slightly high HbA1c increases your risks. This is kind of confirmation that moving up that insulin resistance slope as reflected by HbA1c is going to increase your complications. Another thing to consider is this thought that is out there now, and that is Alzheimer's a form of diabetes? They say here some research studies have suggested that it should be called type 3 diabetes. Now that's not an official designation. This is one of those things we just need to keep an eye on. Either it's going to fall by the wayside and not be recognized, or as more and more evidence comes in, perhaps it'll actually be recognized that dementia can be caused by extreme diabetes. So there are some unanswered questions from what I could find of the research, and I think more research is needed. First is, what is the long-term impact of statins on insulin resistance? And I don't mean 4 years, I mean 10 or 20 years where the impact on our health can really start to manifest itself, and a lot of times gets confused with just the normal progression of aging. We have to ask, does the HbA1c continue to rise, or does it stabilize? A lot of processes are like that. I could see that it may not keep on going up at 0.1% per year on average. It may go up 1 or 2% total and then stop going up. We just don't know because there hasn't been sufficient follow-up. Even the risk calculators don't even pay attention to HbA1c. They treat diabetes as a yes-no thing. It's a considerable risk factor, so I think that they need to actually run studies in which the HbA1c levels are strictly monitored. We have to ask what percentage of users actually have increased HbA1c. Because it is a known side effect, it doesn't mean everybody's going to get it. It's possible that you could take statins and not have an increased HbA1c. But if that's the case, that 0.1% increase that was cited in one article, well, that's an average. Well, if there are people who are having less than that, then there's going to be people who are having greater than that for an increase. Very dangerous situation. And then the question is, well, does it reverse when statins are discontinued? My gut feeling is your insulin resistance isn't going to just go back to what it was before you started taking statins. If you get off statins, you'll probably have to take other measures to reduce your insulin resistance. Maybe it would slowly regress back to what's a normal level for you, but it may be like a ratchet and you may be stuck with it unless you take more extreme measures. So what are my conclusions from all of this? When they say benefits outweigh the risks, I've pointed this out many, many times, those statements are meaningless. They ignore the non-cardiovascular disease, diabetes complications. In other words, they ignore all the blue ones that I showed earlier, and they just look at the heart attack and stroke one. Or they're judging the trade-offs for you. If they are considering the complications, they're saying, well, all those complications are outweighed by what they perceive as the reduction in heart attacks and strokes. Going blind and having your foot cut off and your kidneys fail and not being able to have feeling in your knees and having gum disease, etc., etc. You add all those up and no, better off having those than having a heart attack. That's one of those trade-offs that is kind of tough. When I was a kid, we were always asked, do you want to slide down a mile-long razor blade into a vat of alcohol, or do you want to drown in a bucket of cement? And that's kind of the choice that we're faced with there. Or they're not considering insulin resistance as a continuum. They're just looking at, well, very few people actually cross that line from pre-diabetes into diabetes. There's no problem here. Let's not worry about the people who are extremely diabetic already and we're just making their condition worse. Let's not worry about the people who are in the normal range and we're still pushing them up the slope a little bit. So the question, will you become a hopeless diabetic if you take a statin? Maybe, but not right away. You got to give it time. Don't worry about it. Your doctor has drugs for that. So I hope you recognize that those last remarks I made were facetious or sarcastic or however you want to call them. But that's what I have on this topic. If you like this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topic or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.